Okay. So again, I want to start out with that schematic that I've been using that shows the parallel relationships regarding the passages in this last part of Isaiah that we've been looking at throughout the whole portion of Isaiah. So please pay particular attention tonight to the yellow line that says 60 to 62, the proclamation of a fully redeemed people. And notice that it's right smack dab in the center of all of these balancing statements. Proclamation of salvation for foreigners, proclamation of salvation including foreigners, indictment of wicked leaders, indictment of wicked leaders. So you see how it just closes in on the center. So it's like, the juicy part of a dim sum dumpling that basically you've got the doughy part on the outside, and the really juicy part that you remember is inside. So it's the inside part that we're going to focus on. And the good news is that tonight we're going to focus on 60 and 61, which is two of these three center passages, and that these, unlike many passages in prophecy, are very much upbeat, that they're good news passages as opposed to doom sayings. And as we also do when I'm consistent, I usually give an outline. And through Isaiah, I've been giving my old Hebrew professor's outline of the passage under construction or consideration. And this is Dr. Page Kelly. And he lists the whole last 7 chapters under the proclamation of salvation. But here he talks about chapter 60 as being the glorious salvation of Zion, which I would almost call this kind of salvation. He's talking about the rehabilitation of Zion and the coming of the Gentiles to the light is the first half, and then reversing Zion's humiliation is the last half. Although they overlap, I don't think you can really uh, tie this down into two halves like that. And then perhaps the most familiar passage to us is the tidings of great joy passage of chapter 61, verses 1 through 11, with the first 4 verses dealing with the one who is sent to tell about salvation, and 5 through 9 being people that are blessed of the Lord, and then closing out, as good prophecy often does, with a thanksgiving hymn of rejoicing. So as you can see, the first part of the lesson is going to be about renewal and restoration of God's people and the holy city, while the second part is about the joyful consequences of God's redemptive plan. He saves us for something. So what I truly enjoy about Isaiah 60 is the light motif, as well as the glory theme. Now, in the 8th century, Isaiah gave us that great Advent scripture that we use close to Christmas time of chapter 9. The people who've walked in darkness have seen a great light. And so at that point, Isaiah's listeners may not have even realized they needed to hear that, because they didn't know how dark it was going to get with the conquest and the captivity, and even just how impoverished situations were when they came back, and how heavy duty those Persian taxes were when they got them back. So now, after the darkness of the exile, and now after the disappointment of the initial return, it's like the prophet is assuring Israel that this is the beginning of a new day. So in the first decade of the 20th century, George Adam Smith asserted that chapter 60 was the, quote, spiritual counterpart of a typical Eastern day, end quote. Because he says in the Holy Land, the sun doesn't so much rise as we think about it, as much as leap into the horizon. So if we were to look at this text, my translation is get up, show illumination, because your illumination has come. And Yahweh's glory, his power, his reputation, his resources dawns upon you. Because, check it out, the darkness covers the earth. A dense cloud covers the nations. But Yahweh dawns on you, and his glory is seen upon you. So the Gentiles will come to your illumination, and kings in front of your dawn. So I really understand Smith's allusion to the idea of that striking dawn in the light of when I was younger and would travel cross country in a car with my parents and my grandparents. And I think that's the first time I ever heard Venus called either the morning or the evening star, because it looks like a bright star both times. Now, in those days, you didn't cross the Mojave Desert during full daylight. We always started really early in the morning. So as a result, I would see this scene that's kind of pictured on the left. I would be waiting for the sunrise, and all of a sudden, the horizon would be lit up, and you'd be almost temporarily blinded. And I really hated starting out while it was still dark. But then when the horizon started to lighten dramatically, I felt like it was going to be an important day. So that's something of what we see here in the first three verses of Isaiah 60. The prophet pictures Jerusalem as a crushed and desolate woman. And yet, when the light comes, it's as though that fortune of that downtrodden, rejected woman has suddenly been reversed. It's been turned upside down. So the light then becomes somewhat analogous to the light when a prisoner in solitary confinement, where it's completely dark in there, and suddenly that door swings open and he or she is released from that darkness, even though they're temporarily blinded by the light. But they welcome the light because the light means freedom and liberation. In Isaiah, we not only encounter the idea of light in the first three verses here, but we're going to encounter it again in verses 19 and 20. Now, light is often a symbol of God's glory. But don't be fooled into thinking that whenever we talk about God's glory, we're just talking about halos. We're just talking about bright lights shining like a theophany where God appears to someone. But this chapter uses two different words, nouns and verbs, for glory. And one of them is the word kavod, which is the Hebrew word for heaviness, which means powerful, influential, lots of wealth, because wealth was heavy in those days. And the other one, which is really about ceremony and appearance. In fact, in some of your translations, you're going to see beatified or beautified or beauty in place of the translation glory, but it can be both. So the heavy kind of glory suggests the actual transforming power of God. And the beautiful form of glory, or the bright and beautiful form of glory, suggests awareness of God's presence. And that last part of the usage, it really fits really well with the first double imperative in these verses. Get up and show illumination. Because just like God's light has transformed their situation, they're supposed to reflect the light of the glory of God with such clarity that all the nations would be drawn to them like a moth to the flame, except instead of dying, they would be saved. And that's that salvation. And when we talk about that illumination, that light aspect, that radiant aspect of glory, I once used an illustration from my wife's work. And this is an actual test in a grocery store on the West Coast where the darker aisle on the left is their old lighting, and the much brighter aisle on the right is Waylene's light design. Now, the question, there is the before over there and the after on the other side. And the question is, if you were going to buy groceries, which aisle do you think you would spend the most time on? And it's probably going to be the one that's brighter lit, because you could read all the nutritional labels. You could quickly find the brands that you were looking for. If it was a produce aisle, you would even be able to see how fresh it was just from looking in the aisle. So the light makes a tremendous amount of difference. And Israel, Jerusalem, is supposed to make a tremendous amount of difference by reflecting God's light. So then comes the next double imperative. Lift up your eyes all around you and see. All of them have congregated, they're coming to you. Now that immediately begs the question. A lot of times in polite conversation, you hear people say, they say this is true. And you're wondering, who are they? Well, in this case, we've got them. All of them have congregated and they're coming to you. And we wonder who they are. Well, in this case, these are the conquerors. These are the oppressors. These are the ones who've been doing bad things to Israel and have kept them prisoner. And now they are coming to the land of promise. And they're bringing something precious. Your sons who have been in slavery will come from far off. And your daughters who have also been in captivity will be carried alongside. Or the Hebrew could actually read literally on the side, or as one translator put it, on the hip. But when you see that your oppressors are now the immigrants and the would-be trade partners who are coming to you, it's significant. In business, there is a ploy that some businessmen use. And in politics, there is a ploy that some politicians use. And that is they make people come to them, which says, I'm more important. I'm more powerful. My time is more valuable. If you want an audience with me, you come to me. And the irony here is that these former captives, these people who've been beaten down, are now the ones that others are coming to. They're more important than they have ever been. So as a result, then you will look and be radiant. You see what's happening, and it's going to change your whole appearance. And be radiant, oh, there's that light again. Your determination, your heart will pulse and expand. Why is your heart going to palpitate? Why are you going to be more determined? Because, check it out, the wealth of the seas will be turned over to you. The wealth of the nations will come to you. They took everything you had. They even took your best and brightest from your population. They took everything. And now everything's coming back to you. In fact, when we get a little further along into chapter 61, we're going to see that everything comes back double, comes back with extra interest. Check out all the beautiful images that the prophet uses here. In verse 6, an abundance of camels will overwhelm you. Young camels from Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba will come. And what are they going to bring? Gold and frankincense they shall bear, and they shall declare the praise of Yahweh. Wait a minute, are these Midianites Yahweh worshipers? Nope. Ephah? No. Sheba? No. These are all pagans, but because of what God is going to do with Jerusalem and Israel, then Yahweh will be praised. And we're not finished yet. There is wealth with a purpose. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. This is over on the east side of the Jordan. The rams of the Nabateans, east side of the Jordan, shall serve your needs. What are your needs? Your needs are to worship. They shall be accepted as pleasing upon my altar, and I will glorify my glorious or beautiful, perhaps we could even say radiant, house. But notice that one of the purposes for this massive wealth is for worship. God doesn't give us wealth to hoard. God doesn't give us, wealth to manipulate people with. God gives us wealth to use for him and for his kingdom. And that's a very vital thing. And sometimes people forget it. They just want to be rich for the purpose of being rich. And then back when I used to read Isaiah in the King James Version, I just didn't understand what was going on here. And when I look at the Hebrew, it makes a little bit more sense to me, because if we take 8 and 9 together, we get an image. So who are the ones who fly like a cloud and like doves to their coops or their ledges or their windows? Well, what do clouds and doves have in common? They're both white. And then, even though I didn't quite get it yet, verse 9, certainly the islands are waiting for me, ships of Tarshish first. Now, Tarshish is the coast of Spain, very wealthy in terms of ores, where copper and tin and the like, very valuable to the ancient world. So the islands are waiting for me, for God. And what's going to happen? The ships of Tarshish are going to come to bring God's children from afar to bring silver and gold with them for the name of Yahweh your God and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has glorified you, made you beautiful to honor him. Now, the image on the left is not merchant ships. This is the Greek ships at the Battle of Salamis, and the Greeks and Persians, the Battle of Salamis. But the reason I put it in there is because you have all those ships on the right with those white sails, and you can see how it might look like a smattering of clouds, or it might look like a covey of doves coming in. And this wealth is going to be so prevalent that it's going to look, like a bunch of doves coming in. But before we go any further, I want to make a caveat. August Piper, in his mid 20th century commentary, reminds us that ultimately these prophecies at the center of this last part of Isaiah are about spiritual wealth and a spiritual nation and the new Israel. Now, to be sure, God did provide some physical blessings. Did foreigners bring their silver and their gold with them? Yes. Did foreigners rebuild their walls? Well, you say, not really. Nehemiah rebuilt the walls. But if you remember, the funding came from Persia. The funding came from Persia. In that sense, foreigners did rebuild the walls. And their kings shall serve you. Yes, Darius and Artaxerxes did make it possible for them to come back to rebuild. So, yes, like this portion of the wall, probably built by Nehemiah on the right, in that same sense, their kings shall serve you. And then God says something strange. He says, although I struck you in my anger, in my favor, I have compassion toward you. Now, this is sometimes called a chiasmus. It's a reversal like an X. Because if you look, the two prepositional phrases in the middle of that last part, in my anger, in my favor, are exact opposites. So God is saying, although I struck you in my anger, in my favor, I have compassion toward you. And that last part would be more important. And so it goes on to say, your gates shall be open constantly. Neither day nor night shall they be shut, so as to bring you the wealth of the nations with their kings led in procession. Now, the gates are open all the time. Isn't that a security risk? Well, absolutely, it would be. However, the implication is that they're open 24/7, or probably 24/6, since they would be not doing business on the Sabbath. But they would be open constantly. They would be open 24 hours a day, so that whenever these foreigners came with their wealth, they would bring it. And even their kings led in procession. Remember what I said earlier about making someone come to you? Wow, how the shoe is on the other foot with Israel, considering the fact that kings are now coming for their audience. And in verse 12, there's even a threat. For the nation and the kingdom which do not serve you shall perish, and those nations shall be utterly desolate. But he doesn't deal with the doomsaying very long because he jumps to something else positive. The glory of Lebanon shall come to you. Cypress, elm, and pine together. Once again, what's the purpose of this wealth? To beautify or glorify the place of my sanctuary. And I will make my house glorious. Or in some manuscripts, I will make the place of my feet glorious, the place where God comes to rest. Comes to rest as being present, being active in human affairs. And that's pretty powerful. I like this because this is a grove of cedars in Lebanon. I don't like it because it's one of the few remaining groves of cedars in Lebanon, because they basically stripped a lot of that country of their own glory, of their own cedars of Lebanon. But in this case, the cedars of Lebanon are important. Why? Because they were used in the first temple. So are you going to use inferior materials in the second temple when they rebuild it after the exile? No, you need the glory of Lebanon to come to you. And why? For God's purpose, to build his house and make it beautiful. And with cedar, even to make it smell beautiful and to last longer. But that's not all, because it says, humbly there shall come to you, bowing in homage, all the sons of those who rejected you. And then the prophet gives us three designations for Jerusalem. One, city of Yahweh, the place where God makes himself known personally. Zion, the hill where God wants his temple. And the Holy One of Israel, in apposition with Zion, the idea is that's where God is going to be as the Holy One of Israel. So instead of being desolate in verse 15 and despised because nobody bothers to pass through, nobody bothers to come, now God says, I'll make you, and here's a typical Hebrew construction, an everlasting excellency, an exaltation for generations. And it says, you'll suck the milk of nations and suck the breasts of kings. Those people who suck the life out of you are now going to give life to you with their wealth. And as a result, you will know that I, Yahweh, am your rescuer and your redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob. And 17 lists all the good stuff that they're going to bring. I had intended to do a slide on all the precious metals, but I didn't have time to get it all in because of the late train today. But before I post it, I'll put it on there. But notice it goes, instead of bronze, a lower level metal, I'll bring gold. And one step above bronze even is iron, but I will bring silver. And instead of wood, which rots, I'm going to bring bronze. And instead of stones, which are hard to work, I'm going to bring iron. And I'll make all of your judges peaceful and all of your rulers righteous. And so there will be no more violence in your land. And guess what the word for violence is here? Hamas. That's the word for violence in Hebrew, Hamas. Not exactly spelled the same as the Palestinian Arabic Hamas, but nonetheless, I think it's interesting that we have that sound alike. But as a result, the walls are going to be called salvation and the gates praise. But here's something that I think is cooler. And that is in chapter 60, verse 19, it says, the sun shall no longer be the illumination of day for you, and the moon shall not illumine you for brightness, but Yahweh will be your illumination forever, and your God shall be your spotlight, your glory, your honor, your beauty. And this sounds so much like Revelation. You feel like John the Seer must have had the same idea here. Because the city, the holy city, does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it because the glory of God gives it light. And then, even more specifically, just as it used to say, Yahweh shall be your illumination in Isaiah, the Lamb is its lamp in Revelation. So the nations will walk by the Lamb's light, and the kings of earth will bring their splendor into the Lamb's light. So, is it even possible for this to happen? So, your people, all of them, will be righteous, and forever they shall hold title to the land as a sprout of his planting, an accomplishment of his hands to cause you to have honor, beauty, or glory? Will they have title to the land? Will they do what they're going to do? Isaiah likes to talk about gardens. He's going to talk about gardens specifically when we get to Isaiah 61. So we have some people here planting and putting shoots in the soil so that you can get more mature plants later. What it's saying is that we, or as God's people, Israel as God's former people, are the shoots, the sprouts that God plants in his land of promise. And as the new Israel, we are God's accomplishment, and our purpose is to bring honor, beauty, and glory to God. But you know what? We don't feel righteous because a lot of times the Christian life is a roller coaster for us. And the Christian life is a roller coaster for us because we constantly fall, we constantly go down. And it's pretty frightening to have it that way. But God's promise is he's not letting go forever. Okay, I'm back. I had to use the hotspot on my phone to get back. So can you still see? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. I can see you.
Okay, let's see if we can get back to the screen. Because I don't think you have the screen right now. It says I am. Okay, have you got that? The smallest becomes 1,000. Okay. And so the smallest becomes 1,000, and the least significant becomes a substantial nation. Now, the smallest becomes 1,000 is pretty exciting here because it means more than you think it does. Because 1,000 is a nice round number. And it is also sometimes used to represent a military division, a military fighting unit. So when it says Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his tens of thousands, it really means Saul has killed his military units and David has killed 10 times as many military units as Saul has, and that's the direction that it goes in that regard. Also, 1,000 as a nice round number also represents the idea of a clan. So it isn't the usual word for clan, but sometimes it's used to represent a clan. So sometimes I like to do this 100 Years War poem, and it's in English, so I beg your pardon if it's not of any use to you. But it's about the insignificant becoming significant. And this is about the horse. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the kingdom was lost. And all for the want of a horseshoe nail. So it's a cute little poem, a cute little rhyme. And the intent of it is simply to say, don't overlook the insignificant. And that's what God was saying uh, at that time. So at this point, if we pay attention to the wording, it seems like Isaiah 55 through 66 is focused on the rebuilding of Zion, Israel, where Isaiah 40 to 54 was focused on the exiles returning. So I mentioned that because in a moment, we're going to very specifically see that idea of building. So the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Yahweh has placed anointing upon me to declare good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bandage those broken in will, to proclaim liberation to the imprisoned, opening to those constricted, to proclaim the year pleasing to Yahweh and the day of vengeance belonging to our God, to comfort all the ones mourning. So you'll probably remember that the first verse and a half of this chapter 61, that first verse and a half was what Jesus read in the synagogue when he read it in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19. And then in Luke 4:21, he proclaimed it was fulfilled. But did you notice the part of these verses that Jesus left out? Right, it was the day of vengeance. Because at this point, at the beginning of his ministry, Jesus was quoting Isaiah 61 to announce the accessibility of his kingdom, that he was making very real with his ministry. So when he comes again, we'll see that day of vengeance, and that'll fulfill this for real, um, because he'll come to judge the people who are against the kingdom and those who have oppressed God's people. Of course, Jesus was able to use these verses the Holy Spirit had inspired because God made it clear that these were the proverbial good tidings of great joy. And the original prophet is aware that it's God's intention for him to thrill the people who desperately need to be thrilled with good news, good tidings. And so at this point in time, we're seeing how God operates with men, how God transforms hearts, wills, minds by means of good news, optimistic goals, optimistic visions, optimistic hopes for what God is doing. And the purpose is to comfort all the ones mourning. But even though Jesus didn't quote that, we can go on and we can read in verse 3 that says, to put in place for the ones mourning in Zion, to give them luxury in place of nothingness, oil of joy instead of mourning, a cloak of praise instead of a burdened spirit. And as a result, they'll be called trees of righteousness, the planting of Yahweh for the purpose of his splendor, his glory, his visible beauty. What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to make sure that when people are mourning, that we give them something better for what they don't have. And noticing the typo there on oil, you must think I'm trying to be French and not succeeding or something. I don't know anyway. But at this point, the promise is a substitution of splendor in place of humiliation. So what I translated out of as nothingness is most commonly translated as ashes. Why? Because ashes is what one covers themselves with in a mourning ritual in the ancient world. And the word translated as garlands in some translations, or even as a ceremonial turban in others, has that root idea of splendor or luxurious ornamentation. And it's a really neat wordplay because the Hebrew words use the same three consonants in a different orientation. So look at the three consonants down here. You know, the one that looks kind of like a backwards bass clef, and the one that looks kind of like a curvy X, and the one that looks just like a curve. Well, that's the word pa'ar, which could mean splendor, garlands, and turban. But it's replacing a fair. And you notice you've got the curvy X, you got the backwards bass clef sign, and you've got the curve. But they're in a different order. And so the Hebrews would have recognized this. So when you have on the left a fair, ash, being replaced by something resplendent like Peor, it's a real emphatic idea of transformation for their situation. And so in the next two verses, we're going to discover that even though the exiles were very likely the hard workers at the hard, laborious jobs during the exile, that those very populations who held them captive were now going to be the hard laborers in the new, rebuilt, restored Israel. Those very people who had written Israel off would now take notice and even immigrate to Israel itself for the low-level jobs that they had previously sneered at. Why? Because God judged the conquerors. And they will remodel the ancient ruins. They will erect earlier devastations. They will make new desolate cities, generational devastations. They aren't going to make new desolate cities. They're going to make desolate cities new. Uh, and aliens will stand and shepherd your flocks, and the children of foreigners will be your plowmen and your vine dressers. So I was talking about how that the emphasis of this latter part of Isaiah is on rebuilding. And the verb that I translated as remodel here is really the verb to build. And that verb is found proportionally more in Isaiah 55 to 66 than in any other part of the Old Testament. And we see it in Isaiah 58:12. We saw it in the last chapter in chapter 60, verse 10. We see it here in 61:4. Next session, we'll see it in 65:21 and 23. And even when we get to the last chapter, we'll see it in 66:1. So there were great expectations of a complete reversal and of the shoe being on the other foot. But priests of Yahweh, you will be called. They'll say of you, servants of our God. You will consume the wealth of nations, and you shall adorn yourselves in their glory. In place of your shame, a double portion. In relation to that, they rejoiced. Confusion is their lot. Therefore, in your land, you shall possess a double portion. Joy forever shall happen for you. So again, I want to note the emphasis that ancient languages and to some extent modern languages do. By shifting the normal word order around, the emphasis becomes different. In this case, in Hebrew and in Greek reflecting Hebrew, you generally start with the verb. But here, the verb called is later. So the emphasis is on the noun right at the front, priests of Yahweh. So what does this have to do with us? We are the new Israel. We're the ultimate fulfillment of this prophecy. Because as Israel was supposed to be priests of Yahweh, mediators of his good news, we as the new Israel are called to be priests of Yahweh, new mediators, the new Israel. So the emphasis, the same emphasis that we find repeated in the Petrine letters, the letters from Peter in the New Testament, is on God's people as priests, as mediators of God's message of salvation. And to demonstrate that salvation, they're going to receive tangible blessings from God. The shoe is, as I've said before, on the other foot, where once the Israelites were humiliated, imprisoned, and oppressed, now they get a double reward, a double portion. Now, did you notice the same wording as in Isaiah chapter 40? the second verse of the second half of Isaiah, that prophecy said Israel had already paid double for their sins. The negative was already calculated, and now the positive was on its way. So, where in Isaiah 40, verse 2, the people had already paid for their sins with exorbitant interest, now they're going to be blessed with God's extravagant interest. And my translation continues, pointing out the disparity between the former oppressors who ridiculed Israel and their current state under God. And I used that second person pronoun you, but there are some Hebrew texts that actually read third person pronouns like they and them. So in that case, if we were to read verse 7 instead of as I have it here, and it would still be in place of your shame, a double portion in relation to that they rejoiced. Confusion is their allotment. But now, therefore, in your land you shall possess a double portion. Joy forever shall happen for you. But God has a promise that's going to affect them in the next two verses. Because I, Yahweh, love justice, I hate robbery with fraud, and I will give their payment in truth, and a covenant that lasts forever I will cut for them. This is the people who suffered, and their seed shall be known among the nations, and their descendants among all the peoples. Everyone seeing them will acknowledge them, because they are the seed blessed by Yahweh. So in this case, the they becomes them watching and saying, I want to have some of what God's people have right here. Notice the emphasis on seed, on offspring, because they are the seed blessed by Yahweh. But let's go up and be consistent here. Changing the word order emphasizes truth. Actually, what it literally would say in Hebrew is, and in truth, I will give their payment. And a covenant that lasts forever, I will cut for them. And if you've heard me preach very often, you know about this cutting a covenant as being like slaughtering animals to guarantee the covenant. And yet, because God is cutting the covenant, God is providing the sacrifice, much as God did for Abraham in Genesis 22. But their seed will be known. And then, in a very typical form, because it's because of Yahweh's blessing that all this is going to take place. So, in a very typical Hebraic way of saying something, rejoicing, I will rejoice in Yahweh. My very being, my life's blood, my personality, everything about me shall exalt in my God. Why? Because he has clothed me in garments of salvation. He covered me with a robe of righteousness. The issue here is whether to translate the word that I translated as righteousness as victory, as many translations do. Well, I believe the two go together because God's people need righteousness in order to experience victory, as well as to accomplish God's will. And I also believe it's a robe of righteousness in verse 10 here, because it ultimately corresponds to the breastplate of righteousness in Ephesians 6. But even more so, because we've already said they were called to be priests of Yahweh in verse 6. And in Psalm 132:9, the phrasing is priests are supposed to be clothed in righteousness. And so if Israel has inherited the role of priests, they need to make sure they are clothed in righteousness. And this is an image that's taken over into the New Testament because in the Pauline letters, he says, don't clothe yourself with all of these evil things of the flesh. Instead, clothe yourself with spiritual garments. Well, these garments of salvation are spiritual garments, and that's significant. And the reason for the picture, because the prophet specifically said, just as a bridegroom adorns himself with a turban, and a bride, not a bridge, adorns herself with her jewels. I made this slide when I was on the train, and whenever the train jerked, sometimes I would hit an extra key. I missed that one. Uh, I'll fix it before I upload it. Okay. And a bride adorns herself with her jewels. So you see his turban and you see, her jewels. So even though this is an Indian wedding, it's very typical of ancient Oriental weddings in that you have the special adornment for the bridegroom and the bride. But that also dovetails with the New Testament because we know that as the church, we are supposed to be the bride of Christ. So we probably should adorn ourselves with not only the robe of righteousness, but also with the jewels of all the spiritual gifts God has given us. And the last metaphor in this chapter, because this is a short 11-verse chapter, is because as the earth delivers its sprouts and as the garden causes its seeds to spring up, so Lord Yahweh causes righteousness to spring up as well as praise before all the nations. Now we think a garden is beautiful when everything is in season like it is here, and you have lush greens and beautiful colors. It takes a lot of work to keep a garden like this, pretty much. And Yahweh is the one who does the work in us as his garden. He causes righteousness to be the flower, righteousness to be the shoot that becomes a tree, righteousness to spring up. And if we are righteous, then instead of calling us hypocrites, the world is going to say they seem to live what they talk. And so maybe I ought to pay attention to what they say. So that's a short version